Meta humor can be a very useful tool when writing stories, as it can allow more outlandish, cliche, or simply strange ideas to be introduced in a way that the viewer will accept. Because if even the writer is offhandedly saying exactly what the audience is thinking, it makes the whole thing easier to swallow. But as with anything else, one has to actually know how to use it to achieve the desired effect, as many have criticized just how self-aware certain movies will get all in the name of a cheap gag. And saying this as a man who's written books, that is not how meta humor should be used. And today, I'd like to go over a movie that actually does a surprisingly good job with how it handles meta humor in order to demonstrate how it should be used. And there will be spoilers for the movie in question ahead. So in case you haven't seen it yet and don't want to know what happens, you should probably remain on the lookout. I won't be giving any other spoiler warnings in this video. Okay, so to start off simply, meta humor has to be sincere if it's going to work in any given story. A movie can't have an almost 10-minute action set piece full of impressive stunts and visuals, and then when it's all over, have a character simply shrug their shoulders and say, "Well, that happened." Because the only reason that's being said is simply to try and get a laugh out of the audience. And moreover, it makes it seem like the writers aren't confident in the story they're trying to tell. Because as I just said, meta humor is often used to help excuse elements in a story the audience might not accept if played straight. But in an action movie, the audience is going in with their suspension of disbelief cranked all the way up. So the movie doesn't need meta humor for the viewer to accept everything they're seeing. And using it makes it seem like they don't trust themselves to make the movie good enough without having to make fun of it. I mean, if a James Bond movie involves him being kidnapped by aliens and going to Pluto, then some meta humor would definitely be needed. But if it's just a standard car chase that every member of the audience is expecting to see, special attention doesn't need to be called to it. And if it is, that's only going to detract from it, not add anything of value. To put it another way, when meta humor is insincere, it makes it look like the writers are laughing at themselves because they're embarrassed by what they've created and are desperately trying to salvage it any way they can. Now, whether or not that's actually the case is irrelevant, because all it ends up accomplishing is making the audience less apt to like what they're seeing. When meta humor is used sincerely, however, it makes it look like both the audience and writers are laughing at a mutual joke in which the writer is poking light fun at themselves. And because of that, it makes the viewer more accepting of it, because, for lack of a better way of putting it, it makes the writer come across as a good sport, or that they know when to admit that they're not the most clever in a way that's genuinely funny. That's why something like Deadpool is so hilarious, because not only is he completely shameless, but he's not afraid to riff on anybody, be it himself, his own studio, or something completely unrelated. If he finds fault in something, he will make it known. And again, the fact that he's willing to include his own writers and himself in that only makes it funnier in this case, because it's all completely sincere and not just used for a cheap gag. And similarly, one movie that perfectly knows how to use meta humor to its fullest advantage is actually Captain Underpants, the first epic movie, if you can believe it. Because when you really look at it, a lot of the jokes are ones that have been used many times before, especially the meta ones. And yet, here they're a lot funnier than in most of those other movies. Why is that? Because, first of all, it's the movie playing into how ridiculous the whole concept is. I mean, the movie's literally called Captain Underpants, and its plot basically amounts to two students hypnotizing their principal into becoming a superhero clad only in underwear without any brains. And rather than even try to play something like that even remotely straight, the movie is constantly shining a spotlight on how absolutely ridiculous the whole thing is. And it's actually pretty funny as a result. And for just one example of that, take when they first hypnotize Crump into becoming Captain Underpants. Both of them are baffled by the fact that the ring actually worked and fully admit that they thought it was just a toy. And that's honestly a lot funnier than if the movie tried to give some kind of complex explanation for why the ring worked. Because no matter what they came up with, nothing would change the fact that most of the audience would be thinking exactly what George and Harold express. So the writers cut right to the chase and has them beat the viewer to the punch in expressing shock at what happened, allowing everyone to laugh with the writers instead of at them. Because again, even apart from saying what the viewer is thinking, the fact that their reactions are played dead straight only makes the whole thing funnier, because they aren't desperate for the joke to land and have confidence in their material, as well as that it has them play the audience surrogate in that moment. And all of this applies just as much to the ending as well, where they destroy the ring and then express exasperation at the fact that it didn't break Crump's hypnosis, which is once again exactly what the audience is apt to be thinking. And then there's perhaps the movie's best use of meta-humor, which is when George and Harold react like it's the end of the world if Crump puts them in separate classes, despite the fact that they literally live right next door to each other, and it's obvious that they're way overreacting. And instead of trying to play their distress straight and risk the audience getting annoyed with them, the movie plays their overreaction for laughs, to the point that they even admit at the end that it's not as big of a deal as they made it out to be. But seriously, them freaking out so hard over the thought that they might be in separate classes, to the point that Harold is saying they'll end up awkwardly saying hi to each other at the mall before evil robots with lasers go on the attack, and all the while this being represented with sock puppets, is really meta-humor at its finest. And that's only just a few examples of that. The movie is just littered with self-referential hilarity. Heck, even George and Harold saying multiple times that they should stop their mischief, but fully admit that they won't simply because they're having too much fun, is honestly a great way to keep them sympathetic despite everything they're doing. Because even the writers are acknowledging that despite being the heroes of the story, they aren't being very heroic. Though funnily enough, the scene towards the end where George and Harold stop the climax and make very simple drawings of what played out actually came about because they were running out of money. So when they say that showing the entire climax would make the movie go over budget, they're actually being dead serious. It just so happens that the movie did such a good job of nailing its meta-humor up until that point that the scene doesn't feel out of place at all and like something that was put in as a joke rather than actually for practicality's sake. And the very fact that this scene works so well only just goes to show how well the writers understood the kind of comedy they were employing. And finally, there's also the fact that the movie's meta-humor allows its more sincere moments to actually work as intended. And this is perhaps most evident with Benjamin Crump himself. Because at first he just looks like a stereotypical evil principal that would normally be the villain of this kind of movie, and thus George and Harold treat him as such, even after turning him into Captain Underpants. But then they get a glimpse at his home life and see that he actually leads a pretty sad existence. And in the end, they not only come to feel sorry for him, but also want to help him. Because as is often the case in real life, Crump isn't evil, he's just stressed and unhappy, and takes it out on everybody else. And to that end, as they come to be even slightly nicer to him, he also comes to see that maybe George and Harold aren't just worthless juvenile delinquents either, and even compliments them on their stories. And the fact that the movie plays all of this straight, in contrast to almost everything else, only makes it even more effective. To put it another way, you wouldn't expect a movie with the title Captain Underpants to actually be moving in any way. But when it comes to Crump and the kids learning to understand each other, it actually manages to be just that. Now, as I've noted in other videos, humor is extremely subjective by nature, and meta-humor is no different. So you don't have to agree with anything I said regarding how funny or unfunny anything I just went over is. All I was trying to do was explain from an objective writing standpoint how meta-humor should be used in a movie. But once again, if you disagree with anything I said, that is perfectly fine. The only point I wanted to make here is that if a movie is going to try and use self-referential humor to get the audience to accept something they might not otherwise, then it has to know how to use it, or else it's going to end up achieving the opposite result. And when opinions are taken out of the equation, Captain Underpants, the first epic movie, is honestly a great example of using meta-humor without making a mockery of either the writers or the story being told. As I noted before, it's all about getting the viewer to laugh with the writers rather than at them, and Captain Underpants most definitely achieves that. Unlike so many other movies out there that think calling attention to something automatically makes it funny no matter what. Okay, I think I've made my point with all of this quite clear. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that Captain Underpants, the first epic movie, is a good example of meta-humor done right? Or do you believe it isn't funny and that there are plenty of other movies much more deserving of that distinction? Please let me know in the comments below. And as I just got through saying, you don't have to agree with anything I said in this video if you don't want to. Comedy is a very subjective genre, and what's hilarious to one person may be totally unfunny to somebody else. So if you think I couldn't have come up with a worse example of what I was trying to demonstrate, or even that the concept of meta-humor itself is inherently unfunny, it is your right to think that, and nobody can tell you you're wrong. And thank you all for watching. It is all very appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.